Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick. And greetings to all of you listening from places like Nantucket, Massachusetts, Fort Worth, Texas, Compton, California, Cuernavaca, Mexico, Vilnius, Lithuania, and Dublin, Ireland. Welcome back and settle in, because this time I've got something a little different for you. Now, you know that once in a while I like to talk about aviation, but I'm going to do you one better, because in terms of high performance, there's nothing quite like rockets and spaceflight. During the early days of the Cold War, the progress of missile technology meant that the two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, would soon be capable of launching nuclear warheads on a rocket and striking one another. And with that, the arms race gave rise to the space race. The U.S. space program began in the 1950s by developing what they called launch vehicles, the rockets that could reach beyond our planet and into the heavens. And there was a long series of them: the Redstone rocket, the Atlas, the Saturn. And it wasn't long before NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was organized. Right away, the first manned U.S. space flights were being planned. The Mercury program and America's first 7 astronauts being sent up in a tiny one-man capsule and demonstrating we could orbit the Earth and return home safely. Next up was Project Gemini, this time with a 2-man capsule that developed the endurance and procedures that would be necessary for the ultimate goal of landing on the moon. And that was the task of the Apollo program, beginning with the first 3-man launch in 1968. There were mishaps along the way, illustrating just how dangerous it was. Now, the Mercury program began in 1959, and 10 years later, on July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the moon. In the 1980s, the Space Shuttle program again made history with the world's first reusable spacecraft and 135 missions over the next 30 years. And for a little while, spaceflight began to seem routine. But in 1986, the sudden and catastrophic loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger reminded all of us that none of it should be taken for granted. My guest today was a NASA insider and one of the thousands of unsung heroes that made spaceflight possible. Don Nichols began his career with NASA during the Mercury program and retired while the Space Shuttle program was still in full swing. And his recollections are fascinating. Challenges and problems, successes and failures, and even some of the black programs, top secret stuff. For example, the Space Shuttle was being used for intelligence gathering and military projects. And I suppose that's no surprise, but it is interesting. Don is into his 90s now, but he's sharp and engaging, and it's a fascinating glimpse into what could still be considered the greatest challenge that humanity has ever undertaken: to actually leave our planet and explore the wider universe. It's impossible to tell this story quickly, so this is a long episode, but I think you'll enjoy it. One thing I want to note is that we did have some audio issues toward the end, but I don't think it takes away from the story. But I just wanted to mention that this kind of stuff happens from time to time. And also, I need to mention that if you're an iPhone user, there have been some changes in the latest operating system update. And it's resulted in something like a 5 to 10% drop in downloads, and thousands of podcasts have been affected, including this one. And when I saw the numbers recently, I thought, what is going on? But this explains it. Basically, the Apple Podcast app is now pausing automatic downloads if you haven't listened for more than 15 days or to the last 5 episodes. And then when you return, you may not see episodes that you've missed. I know some people take a break sometimes and then they catch up later. Some of you tend to binge listen 2 to 3 episodes at a time. Everyone has their own listening habits, but long story short, if you're using Apple Podcasts to listen to the show, make sure you have automatic downloads turned on. And you can always go to horsepowerheritage.com and click on the podcast button at the top, and you'll be able to listen from there as well. Now, one good thing about Apple's software update is that they're now displaying the individual episode art within the app, which is something that Spotify and others have been doing for some time, so I'm glad they finally caught up. And I've always created unique episode art since day one, so if you've done the software update, you're now seeing that art in the catalog, on your lock screen, and within CarPlay, so that's pretty cool. Don't forget to follow Horsepower Heritage on your favorite podcast app. Leave me 5 stars and a quick review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And tell your friends, because all of those things help new people discover the show. All right, we're going to resume the countdown, so stay right there because we're blasting off with Don Nichols. And that's coming up right after this. This episode of Horsepower Heritage is sponsored by Model Citizen Diecast. No matter what's in your garage, you can fit all your automotive heroes on a shelf. And they've got you covered, whether it's 1/43rd scale, 1/18th scale, or even the ginormous 1/8 scale masterpieces from the Amalgam Collection. Go to modelcitizendiecast.com and get 10% off when you use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout. Limitations apply. From race cars to street cars and everything in between, it's Model Citizen Diecast, because your inner child still wants to play with cars.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. We propose to accelerate the development of the appropriate lunar spacecraft. We propose to develop alternate liquid and solid fuel boosters, much larger than any now being developed, until certain which is superior. We propose additional funds for other engine development and for unmanned exploration, explorations which are particularly important for one purpose which this nation will never overlook: the survival of the man who first makes this daring flight. But in a very real sense, it will not be one man going to the moon. If we make this judgment affirmatively, it will be an entire nation, for all of us must work to put him there.
Well, Don, thanks for having us in.
Pleasure. Glad to have you here.
You spent many, many years at NASA. In fact, you were there, it's fair to say, at the dawn of the space age.
Pretty close.
And when you retired, the shuttle was flying.
Yep.
So you saw it all.
Yes, I was fortunate to be in the space business almost from the beginning. I joined NASA in the middle of the Mercury program, but I had been in missiles since before that. That's where I got my experience. So yes, it's been an interesting career.
You got into aerospace through the Navy, right?
That's correct. In 1957, I joined the Navy. After boot camp, I got sent down to Anacostia Naval Station in Washington, and that was the training location for the Mark 1A guidance computer, they called it at that time, and that was the control system for the big guns on the ships. And that's when I learned about the beauty of mechanical items. Everything that's done with a modern computer with our modern ships was done mechanically. The Mark 1A was about the size of a table, a little bigger, and it did multiplication by gear ratios, it did addition and subtraction with a differential, and all the trig functions were cut into cams and a lot of little motors. Wow. So all of the aiming of the big guns, taking into account the roll, pitch, and yaw of the ship and the distance to the target, all that was done mechanically with little electric motors.
After the Navy, you went to North American Aviation?
Yeah. Out of the Navy, I got selected for the ROTC program. I discovered I had an aptitude for aptitude tests, so instead of being a seaman, I became a midshipman. and went to the University of South Carolina. I had already been approved to go to the University of Rochester, which was near where my family lived in Western New York. And when my orders came out, University of South Carolina. So I went to the officer that I was in charge of that part of the Navy, and I said, the Navy made a mistake. I'm supposed to go to Rochester. And he said, the Navy doesn't make mistakes. You're going to South Carolina. So that's what I did. And I graduated from South Carolina. And as a senior, I was given opportunity to interview a number of companies. And North American Aviation on the West Coast was doing interesting work, and I had the opportunity to hire on with them.
So you never were actually commissioned as a naval officer, or?
That's correct.
How did that happen? Because they paid for your schooling.
In my junior year, I decided I really didn't want that 3 years of service afterwards, and so I did some maneuvering and got thrown out of the ROTC, and my VA paid for my last fourth year, and so I got to be a civilian instead of a Navy officer.
Okay. All right, so your next stop was Southern California at North American, and obviously at the time, the LA Basin was the place in aviation and aerospace.
Certainly was. All of the major aircraft builders were in that immediate area. During the war, the contracts were for as much as you could produce, as long as you could produce it. When the war ended, the military was contracting almost totally 3-year contracts to advance technology, get the improved products. And so the entire workforce was all in that area, and when one contract ended, another one started, so they would move. It was close enough that they could move company to company, and there wasn't quite the traffic that we see today either.
Right. Now, there's two North American aircraft that I'm really interested in hearing about. The first is the X-15, right, which was a rocket plane that flew at the edge of space.
Correct.
And then the second is the F-100, which was the first production supersonic jet fighter.
Yeah, I had a direct hand in both of those. My first job after college was to design the leading edge of the X-15 wing. And it was a tube, and in the middle of the fuselage was a tank that held anhydrous ammonia, and that was pumped through the leading edge and exhausted as gas at the end of it, and that was to soak up and get rid of the heat.
So you wouldn't have a meltdown.
Right, because the leading edge, of course, gets pretty hot.
Right.
So in several areas of the X-15 design, where there was questionable technology, they tried several approaches at the same time. And in my case, my wonderful design never got used because they went to a heat sink Inconel leading edge wing.
A different alloy.
A high temperature alloy with strength.
Right.
So that never got used. I was assigned to a small group, about 30 engineers, called Special Projects Group. And so all the little things that came along went to that group, and we had structural people, electrical, hydraulic, everything in that small group for small jobs. And one of the things that came along, the F-100, as you said, was the first high-performance airplane we had. And it was a single-seat airplane. And in the process of training pilots, they were losing F-100s. So the Air Force said, North American, we want you to add an instructor seat to the F-100. So our little group got that assignment, and we added a 3-foot section right behind the pilot seat, which had a instructor's seat, and of course that changed the aerodynamics of the airplane. So North American was very proud at that point that they were one of the first people to have a section that had the computer-driven, an analytically driven hydraulics section. So the company turned them on to see what that would do to the aerodynamics. They also built a wind tunnel test because wind tunnel was the way they did all their aero work up to that point. So when the designs got done, the wind tunnel said, it's going to be a problem, and this new aeronautics section said it's going to be okay. The wind tunnel folks said, well, we'll stand back and see what happens. So we built the modification, built the airplane, and at that time, Scott Crossfield was North American's top test pilot. So shipped the plane out to Edwards, did the final assembly, and Scott Crossfield was to fly it. So our little group all gathered around the boss's desk listening to this test flight, and it took off, and they went through a regularly scheduled set of things, and the disagreement over stability was over horizontal stability, so they did that last. And so over the radio we're listening, and Scott Crossfield said, I'm going into a sharp left turn right now, horizontal turn. And then all of a sudden he said, I'm out of control, and then it went a whole bunch of aero noise. And before the parts landed, we were developing spin doors for the front of the airplane.
Oh, wow.
Turned out the analytical folks didn't have it right, the wind tunnel folks did. So we put little doors that opened in the front of the airplane that broke the horizontal spin. So it was interesting times.
And of course, Crossfield had to bail out.
He bailed out, yes. He had bailed out a number of times. It wasn't his first experience.
Yeah, it's kind of part of the game when you're a test pilot.
Yeah. Yeah, we also, another design I had at North American right after that, we were having trouble finding airfields that were close enough that we could potentially attack Russia. Our aircraft didn't have the long range at that time they do now. And so they came up with a concept called zero-length launch for the F-86. And the F-86 sat on a trailer with a launch rail, and they attached JATO bombs basically at the base of it.
Jet-assisted takeoff.
So you would go to full thrust, light the rocket under you, and in 30 feet you better be airborne. So I worked on that project, and I was just completing my work on the structural part of that. And one day there was an announcement over the PA on a Friday. It said, everyone put your drawings in the boxes that are being distributed, write the contents on the box and your name, and you may go home, and your final check will be mailed to you. You don't have to come back on Monday. And the hangar I was in at that time at LAX held 3,000 engineers, and all of them got laid off that day. So it was pretty exciting times at North American.
Now this was at a time period when the intercontinental ballistic missile didn't yet exist.
Correct.
We were still counting on the delivery of nuclear weapons by a long-range bomber like the B-36 or B-58.
Correct.
And part of that whole picture was also fighter-interceptors that could fly to and shoot down Russian bombers coming the other direction.
Yep.
What was the sort of the mood or the temperature of that time? I imagine it must have been tense.
It was, but the war was a distance away at that time. And one of the experiences at North American, the F-100 was a very fast plane, but it was not highly maneuverable. And at that time, the Air Force was dealing with MiGs at that time, and the MiG was highly maneuverable. And so North American got an order to go to Davis-Monthan Boneyard and pull 30 F-86s out and update them and send them to Vietnam, because the F-86 could fight the Russian airplanes that they were using, and the F-100 couldn't deal with them.
Right. A much slower rate of turn and so forth.
Correct.
Right. So I think slower rate of climb, things like that.
Yeah, it was built as a high-speed airplane and just didn't have the maneuverability.
By the way, we should mention the F-86 was really the first jet fighter interceptor in the United States inventory, and kind of earned its reputation in the skies over Korea fighting MiGs.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that was North American's first jet aircraft, right? I mean, production jet aircraft.
I think that's correct.
Yeah.
It was before my time, but I think that's correct.
Now, you weren't at North American for very long before you went to Douglas Aircraft.
That's correct. North American at that time was bidding on the next generation fighter airplane, and there was a little contest over whether the stores, the armament, should be inside the airplane or hung on the outside, and North American picked the wrong option, and that's how we ended up with a big layoff. The F-107, they did not get the contract. North American had a policy at that time that no new hire got laid off in less than 6 months. So when the 3,000 disappeared, I was still there with a job for another 6 months. And so once those 3,000 had gone out and gone to all the other aircraft companies that were looking for people, then I got laid off. So I was kind of sweating it, but it turned out that I got a job at Douglas Aircraft at Santa Monica Airport, and left North American on a Friday, went to work at Douglas on a Monday. When I walked into the plant in Santa Monica, they were very proud of Douglas's history. And in one of the halls, right in front of where you walk in to go to work, there was a drawing, a 20-foot long, full-scale drawing of a pontoon for an airplane that Donald had drawn. And in college, they make you use ink for your drawings because it's permanent. Donald Douglas had drawn this 20-foot pontoon with ink, and he didn't have any of the splotches on that 20 feet of drawing that I had on all mine in college. It was a very difficult proposition, but they were proud of him, and we engineers could not believe that he was as good as he was at drafting.
And Douglas also, their business lines were different than North American. They were building passenger planes as well as looking for the military contract.
That's correct. DC-6s, DC-7s were the mainline airliners at that time. And I ended up being hired into an interiors group, and the airlines would call for upgraded interiors periodically. And so we had in a back hangar, we had a full-sized airplane, and the new interior would be designed, installed, and then the companies would come by and do a review and see what they wanted changed, or if anything. And so that was always our tough time. We would spend quite a while doing upgrades, and then the airlines would come through, I don't like that, I do like this, I don't like that. So that was an exciting time for us when we had these big reviews. And for one of the reviews of Eastern Airline interior, Eddie Rickenbacker was the president at that time. Great war hero in World War I and then in World War II, and now the president. And so he was getting a little aged, and he was very crotchety. He had a reputation for not putting up with anything from anybody. So for some reason, he came for that review. And so the management of Douglas was all pretty uptight over it. So they made sure everything was just right. And several of our Douglas managers accompanied that particular walkthrough. So they started at the back of the airplane, walked through, and he was with them, and he was just very quiet. Everybody was taking care of business. Got to the front, and he said, does this emergency slide work? And they said, oh, yes, sir, it works. So he went to walk out to the door, and someone beside him said, sir, you have to take your shoes off. And he ignored them totally, jumped on the slide, got about halfway down, his heel caught, and he went tail over tea kettle to the bottom. And everybody in the Douglas management quit breathing and got to the bottom, expecting a major eruption. He got up, dusted himself off, and said, what's next?
Wow. Well, what else could you say? I mean, there's really no way to sort of play that off.
Yep.
Now, Eddie Rickenbacker had also been a racing driver I think after World War I.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten about that part.
Yeah. What was the mood when you learned the news that the Russians had put Sputnik into orbit?
There was kind of a different, depending who you talk to. There were people who were very concerned, but the majority of the people that I was acquainted with said, wow, how about that? When are we going to do it?
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. Here, an artist's conception of how the feat was accomplished. A three-stage rocket. Number one, the booster, in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age.
At that time, there was a big push on in the U.S. The Sputnik was 57.
Right.
NASA was formed in 58. 63 was the presidential statement that we're going to the moon. I went to work for AC Sparkplug in Milwaukee, who had just gotten the contract for the inertial guidance for the Thor missile. The inertial guidance was designed by MIT, but the production went to AC Sparkplug. At that time, they were already flying the control systems for several of the bombers. And so I was actually hired for a control system on one of their bomber systems. And by the time I got to Milwaukee, they had the contract for Thor, so I went directly to the Thor program.
And the Thor was an intermediate range ballistic missile?
Correct. At that time, we were working on the Atlas, just starting the Atlas, starting the Thor. The Atlas was longer range, Thor was shorter, and the Thor could reach Russia from England. And so that's really where it got deployed primarily. There were some Thor sites that were contemplated in the U.S., but they couldn't do the job that needed to be done. Mm-hmm. So I got in the very front end of the Thor program, went through a training course at AC in Milwaukee, and then came out to Vandenberg for the first Thor launch. So very exciting times. And it was, at that time, state-of-the-art. The guidance system for the Thor weighed 500 pounds. The inertial unit was probably 3 feet in diameter, and then a big bunch of electronics that went with that. So it was state-of-the-art, but it sure wasn't very small.
Right.
And the gyros had what they called Fluorolube for a floating for the gyro wheels, and that had to be maintained heated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So
Is that because of the freezing point of the fluid?
Yes. It had to be maintained at a certain temperature in order to have the gyros operate at the speed they needed to. So it had its own unique needs, just like Atlas did with the pressurized tankage, where if the pressure ever went down on an Atlas, it collapsed.
Because the tank was so thin?
Yes, about the thickness of a dime in stainless steel. Wow. So Thor had its issues, and so did the rest of them. But we got a good launch off, had several so good launches. Range safety was kind of new in those days. And on one of the early Thor launches, for some reason it didn't pitch over when it was supposed to. It was going straight up. And so they waited a little bit longer than they should have to blow it. And when they blew it up, pieces the size of refrigerator doors landed in Santa Maria.
Oh, wow.
So the criteria for blowing a rocket changed about that time.
And what they expected it to do was pitch over and point itself towards the Pacific Ocean, right?
Yes, yeah. It was all a programmed trajectory, and the inertial guidance platform with the gyros is able to maintain its stability without regard to what's happening around it with a gimbal system. Mm-hmm. So it operates like a top does and spins for stability. And then they just measure with potentiometers, measure the difference between the angle of that platform that is stable and the rocket, and they have programmed over what the trajectory should be. and it just looks for a difference in potentiometer setting between what it was intended and where it is, and uses that for steering commands.
I think people probably don't fully grasp how fragile a rocket, a missile, a spacecraft is, but they're extremely fragile because every ounce is precious.
Yes. They're normally a single string design where one failure bites you, and you try to carefully make sure you don't have any failures by qualifying each piece that you put into it. So the care is there, but in the early days we had a lot of failures.
Yeah.
The Atlas, in about that same time, probably 2 years later, was going through its launches at the Cape during its early flight, a little bit behind the Thor, and at the Cape they had 18 straight failures, and the word after each failure was, we've got some more data, we're going to launch again. So they didn't wait and fix everything and they finally, after the 18th launch, got it where it was stabilized, and then it was able to be used for the Mercury program. After I was in the early launches of Vandenberg, I was selected to go to Tucson to teach the RAF officers inertial guidance for the Thors they were going to be flying. Went through that over a period of several months, and when that was over, I was called back to Milwaukee in the middle of the winter. And at that time, Milwaukee was all heated with soft coal, and so this beautiful snow after 2 days is all black, and it was cold, it was miserable. I had purchased a 1958 Plymouth convertible, knowing that I was going to be in field service, wouldn't have a house, and so at least I wanted a nice car. Sure. So I bought this beautiful Plymouth convertible, and it was in the dealership being worked on more than I was driving it. And the final straw was a winter day when I went to drive it to work and it wouldn't go into gear, and I had to hike down to a place where I could get some oil, heat it up on my kitchen stove, get it warmed up enough that it would go, and I drove to a dealer and had to trade it in the middle of the winter, and I decided I've had enough of Milwaukee in the winter. That's when I went looking for a job again, and my looking started in Florida, any place that would hire an engineer. And I ended up at Martin, Orlando. They had just gotten the Pershing contract, and that was the first inertial guidance for an Army missile down there. So I ended up in charge of the inertial guidance laboratory for the Pershing, and we were doing development flights at that time, of course, over at the Cape. And the Army brass always liked to come down. It was something they liked to do, is go watch the Pershing launch, because it's Florida and it's winter. So Martin, Orlando had a big tractor trailer, and on the trailer they put a whole bunch of VIP seats, and they would put that out within viewing distance of the launches. And about the third test launch we had, it lifted off the pad, turned horizontal, headed toward that truck. And so the big thing for quite a while in Martin and Orlando at that time was looking at film of the generals jumping.
Right.
And the missile fortunately went over the top and landed in the marsh. But it was a very successful program, but not initially. And one of the things that was interesting to me at that time, there was a debate between the Air Force and the Army over who owned what missiles. And so there was a decision made that 1,500 nautical miles was going to be the point at which Army had below that and the Air Force had above that. The Pershing was a 2,500-mile design. When that edict came out, it immediately lost 1,000 miles of range. And so it became an Army missile less than 1,500 nautical miles. That's politics.
Yeah, turf wars, right?
Yep. My big problem at Martin, Orlando, I loved the job, but I was in charge of the inertial guidance laboratory, and it was the most complicated piece of hardware that Martin dealt with. So they assigned all of their senior technicians to that laboratory. So I had a bunch of super techs working in the laboratory, and they'd all had 15 years of union behind them. And when the paymaster came across the parking lot on payday, they somehow seemed to know that they weren't going to get enough money that week. So I had very little technical time and almost totally fighting the union employees. So I decided pretty quickly that wasn't how I wanted to spend my life. I was a young engineer, and they were old hands union people, and that is not a good mix. So by that time, we had flown the initial Mercury missions, and NASA was hiring because they were growing beyond the Mercury program, and there was an advertisement in the Orlando paper, so I went and applied, and I was totally prepared for what I had heard was the way everything operates in civil service. You fill everything out and then you wait. I interviewed on a Sunday, and I was asked if I could go to work on Monday. So I gave 2 weeks' notice, and I was with NASA.
They needed engineers that badly.
They needed engineers, and they were just getting into the inertial guidance business because the Mercury was a programmed, didn't have to do that.
And by the way, we should just mention, so the Mercury program was essentially proof of concept, right? To prove that we could get a man into orbit.
Yes, prove we could get him there and have him come back alive.
Right.
Gemini went the next step. Gemini's had to prove we could rendezvous because in order to go to the moon, we had to have rendezvous capability, rendezvous and docking. But the rendezvous portion was early part of the Gemini, and by the end of Gemini, we were not only docking, we were transferring between vehicles.
Right. September 12th, 1962, President Kennedy makes his famous moon speech.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
So he threw down the gauntlet. And it was a challenge not just to the United States and our military, industrial, technological might, but also to the Russians.
That's correct. And that announcement was received with mixed emotions by different people. There certainly was a thought that we really aren't in a position to go to the moon. What are you thinking? And the other side of it said, if we get all the help we need, all the money we need, surely we can make it happen. And so that was really the basis for Apollo. Prior to that, the push within the Air Force was to get somebody into space and compete with the Russians for capability in Earth orbit. So the moon gauntlet was a whole change of ballgame.
From your professional point of view, was JFK's challenge realistic?
We certainly had our doubts because we had none of the capability required for that. But by the same token, we had by that time proved that we could put a man in orbit, that to get him back. And so the question then became the design of the rocket more than the spacecraft. The spacecraft had to be designed, and we knew we could do that, but the rocket was a different ballgame, and that's where Wernher von Braun came in.
If we were to start today on an organized and well-supported space program, I believe a practical passenger rocket could be built and tested within 10 years. Of course, it would be foolish to rush headlong into building a 4-stage rocket, man it with a crew, and attempt to fire it into an orbit without first following a step-by-step research and development program.
He had been pushing for the moon program, actually pushing for Mars, but moon initially. So with the work that he was doing in Huntsville, Huntsville had been the Army arsenal for armament, and when he and his crew came in and NASA was formed, that all of that arsenal capability for prototyping was there. Mm-hmm. So he immediately set his people working on rockets, the Jupiter, and so he was convinced it could be done, and a lot of the people in Huntsville were convinced it could be done. The people on the spacecraft side were less confident in the booster. They knew they could do their part, but they weren't sure about those booster guys. They were old Germans, so they weren't sure.
Now, von Braun was a controversial figure. He was deep within the Nazi apparatus.
Yep.
He was responsible for the V-1 and V-2 rockets that they used against the British during the Blitz, and I think throughout the war. He was given an ultimatum by the United States, essentially to work for us. And what was the alternative but to work for the Soviets?
Yeah.
Did you meet von Braun? Did you have any interaction with him?
Did not have personal interaction. I was in a number of meetings with him on the Skylab program. But if I may detour for just a moment back to the Pershing.
Sure.
When I took the job with Pershing, I went back up to Huntsville for 30 days to get their view of the design and the production techniques and the testing be required. And during that period of time, I was in their laboratories, and the laboratory that I was in most of the time had the old workbenches, all of that arsenal stuff. And underneath one of the benches was 3 boxes, 3 big crates, and nobody ever mentioned them. So when I was at the end of the 30 days, I was getting ready to leave, I said, "What's in those crates?" And the guy that was in charge said, "Those are German LEV-3s, which was V2 guidance units." And he said, "Those 3 boxes containing those units are going to be the guidance for the first 3 launches of the Saturn." The inertial guidance for the Saturn was contracted to Bendix. They didn't trust the guidance yet, hadn't flown it. So for the first 3 Saturns, a V2 guidance program was what we flew with the Bendix guidance writing and being checked out. And for the 3 flights, the Bendix performed fine, and so we were okay to go to them and no more V2 guidance.
Fascinating. A little known fact, I'm sure.
They never advertised that.
Right, for obvious reasons. Kennedy didn't make his moon speech in a vacuum. He had already consulted with the director of NASA. It was a calculated risk to make the speech, but he was assured by guys who were in the business to know that it was a realistic goal if they put their mind and budget toward it.
Yes. NASA was formed out of the old NACA, which was the government organization that was responsible for doing the front-end work for aircraft.
National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics.
Yes, they did wing shapes and they did propulsion kind of engine work. And so when NASA was formed, the nucleus of that came out of NACA. So they were aware of and had been experimenting with rocket engines and things. So it didn't come as a total shock. And they were listened to, but they were far more conservative than von Braun was. And there was speculation that Kennedy made that announcement knowing that he wouldn't be president when it happened, or didn't happen.
Right. He didn't have to take the blame if the project fell on its face.
Yep.
Not a month after Kennedy's moon speech, the United States government announces that the Russians are putting intermediate range nuclear missiles in Cuba. And we've overflown the island. We have the photographic intelligence, and now we've got basically an existential threat 90 miles from Miami.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up.
Yeah, I was with NASA at that time, and lived on Merritt Island, and the U-2 was the one that was taking the photographs. U-2 was moved to Patrick Air Force Base, which was about 5 miles from where I lived, and so we would see the U-2 take off every morning, and that would color the news of that day. And we thought we are going to be the first target because we're the ones that are overflying. So locally, there was great concern that we were likely a target. Followed it all pretty closely. The national mood I really can't speak for because I was so focused on what I was doing that I really didn't get a lot of visibility into the national aspect.
Sure. But it was a tense, I think, 1 month period. And the deal was that if we did not put missiles in Turkey, the Russians would quietly remove the missiles from Cuba. And that's the deal they struck.
Well, at that time, Turkey would have been a good spot, but we had alternatives.
Right. Very timely discussion of this right now because there's a lot of talk of a nuclear exchange right now, which is inconceivable. You know, growing up in the 80s, I remember that movie The Day After, and I remember strategic arms limitation talks and
duck and roll.
Yeah, all of that. And President Reagan going to the table with the Soviets. So it's really odd and surreal to see that we're back contemplating these things.
Well, a lot of us thought that civilization had moved beyond that,
right,
and that the mutual deterrence was going to work, and it did for many years. So that you're right. This is an anomaly that I don't think anyone, including our government, knows how to deal with.
Right. So you're at NASA by 62, and you were working on guidance for NASA.
And when I was hired in, I was the guidance group.
Right.
And the very first assignment that I got when I walked in over there, after the final paperwork was signed, my boss said, I need you to go up to MIT and contract for the ground systems that we will need for Apollo at the launch site.
When you say ground systems, Don, what do you mean exactly?
The equipment that will check out and control the guidance on board during the ground processing to make sure that it's all working right, and then the setting it up for the launch, the programming of the computers, all of that hardware. And I said, I don't know anything about it. He said, you got a week to find out whatever you can. So we were learning everything from start. We had no background.
Yeah, you were inventing it.
That's correct.
So the guidance systems are actually operating when the missile, the rocket, is on the pad.
Yes.
They're running.
They're in control from liftoff.
Right.
And so all of the checkout and the assurance that you need, not just for the liftoff and flight, but all of the guidance for the moon and back, all has to be checked out and made sure everything is right. And one of the interesting parts of that time, technology-wise, we didn't have memory to speak of. Mm-hmm. A current watch has more memory than we had when we went to the moon. Consequently, the systems we had would have a software load that would get you up through flight to orbit, and then you would have to change out that software load, put in a new software load for orbital operations, change that out, put a new software set in for translunar, a new set out of that for orbit of the moon, and then the lunar module had its own separate set.
And was that magnetic tape?
It's done by magnetic tape, yes. And so you always had the concern that we can check everything out of that first load, but that's only going to get us to orbit. Are we going to be able to load and confirm the next load? And so there were very elaborate protocols put in place software-wise to make sure that when you put the next load in, that it was correct. So that was a technology that was invented at that time that had never had a need for before.
Right. In those guidance systems, were the guidance systems making computations every second along the way?
Absolutely. Every millisecond.
Right.
Yeah. The entire trajectory is in the computer, and the guidance system is constantly checking what the rocket is doing versus what you want it to do, and using that to control the engines, which in turn control the direction. So yes, it's instantaneous for the whole time.
So the guidance system is relying on data like airspeed from a pitot tube, barometric pressure, the attitude of the craft, all of that stuff.
Yes.
And that's getting fed in, and the data is crunched and computations are made.
Correct. And it's a near instantaneous process.
Right.
We did not have major failures on our guidance systems on any of those flights, but the reliability was the focus of everything in the spacecraft. And whereas in Mercury and Gemini, we were flying military rockets, which all had single strings, which means if you had a single failure, you could lose the mission. For Apollo, the design criteria was fail, operate, fail safe. Triple string, so you had, every calculation was done by 3 different ways, and if one disagreed, it was voted out. When you had 2 of them, if one failed, the other one would get you to a safe position, not necessarily mission safe, not necessarily mission success, but to a safe position. Right. And we had, of course, the escape rocket on the Apollo that would, hopefully, we never had to use it, but would separate you from a booster that was in trouble and bring the astronauts down on parachutes.
And the escape rocket was mounted to the capsule by means of sort of like a spire, right?
Yeah.
On top of the capsule?
Yeah, it was actually a four-legged stool with the rocket on top of it.
Right.
And the distance that was up was just enough that the rocket could ignite without damaging the orbiter.
Mm-hmm. I see. And those were solid rocket motors?
Correct, yeah.
Right. So after handling those guidance systems, what was next for you on Gemini?
My thought was that I would set up the guidance laboratory for Apollo, and my boss walked in and said, you're being assigned as the lead technician for the Gemini 4. And I said, I'm working Apollo. He said, no, you're working Gemini. So I was the lead project engineer on the first EVA that we had on Gemini 4, McDivitt and White.
And EVA is extravehicular
activity.
Right.
We knew that we had to have the ability to be outside. And so that was a test flight, and Ed White was elected to go out, and one of the questions was maneuverability once you get out of the spacecraft. So he was on a tether, but he also had as part of his backpack was a GN2 gaseous nitrogen bottle, and he had a wand in the front of him that had a straight out and a T, and it had nozzles on it. So he was to use that to maneuver, and that was his power for that. And it was set up where it would operate for some 6 or 7 minutes, as I recall. And I think he was a little excited because he ran out of gas in a little over a minute.
Wow.
So Jim McDivitt ended up pulling him back with his tether, and pulled him back with his umbilical, got him back into the spacecraft. But it did prove that we could operate out there, and that there were better ways of maneuvering.
Perhaps most of us have forgotten the precise day. It was June 3rd, 1965. But not many of us will forget the experience of seeing Ed White leave the open hatch of Gemini 4. He said simply, "All right, I'm out." EVA, which began so successfully with this 20-minute walk in space, was not so easy in later flights. We scheduled 5 more EVAs, lengthened the time, and added space work to the flight plan. But we gave the astronaut too high a workload to perform, and the problem was compounded by the pilot's difficulty in positioning himself during work periods. Now we were coming up on the last flight and the last EVA, with questions about EVA still unresolved. And Gemini 12 would launch in 60 days.
One little sidelight on Gemini program. We were flying the Mercury at the time while we were preparing for Gemini manned space. And the Titan that was be the booster for the Gemini was just in development. And the Titan ran into a very significant problem called POGO. The pressure in the tanks is what feeds the engines, and so when you start to lift off, you got pressure in the tanks, and with aero loads, it tends to settle down and give you more pressure, and that pushes you up, and then your system says, no, you're getting too much, so it lets it off, and so you end up with as you go up.
A surge.
And the surges exceeded the structural capability of the tankage and blew the Titans up. The Titans were fueled with hypergolics, NDMH and nitrogen tetroxide.
So these are fuels that when mixed together immediately combust.
That's right. So when you fly the Titan, early Titans, and they blew up, it was usually at about 100,000 feet. And when those two mixed, you got the most hellacious orange, red, yellow, black cloud. And for the second to the last Titan launch before we went to the manned space, I was out at the flight line with several of the astronauts when they launched it. And it went up 100,000 feet and blew to smithereens. And I've never seen such big eyes as on those astronauts that were going to be riding on it. Yeah. Turned out that the Aerospace Corporation, which is the Air Force's technical arm, it's a nonprofit formed specifically to provide technology for the Air Force because their officers rotate routinely and don't have the depth of technical knowledge that NASA had with its own cadre of engineers. So Aerospace and Martin Company were working that problem, and Aerospace very quickly came up with a solution, an accumulator which was able to absorb that pressure. And the next flight was a successful flight. The astronauts were significantly relieved, and it went on to be a successful program.
Yeah, that sounds like an understatement, right?
Yes. That was in the days when the astronauts were everything in the space program. And a local dealer provided new Corvettes for all of the astronauts. And so from the area where all of the offices and facilities were out to the launch pad was close to 3 miles, chosen for a reason, in case of explosion. So the astronauts would race each other out to the pad and back in their Corvettes. And Pan American Aviation had the base contract at that time for supply of all of the services, including security. If one of us NASA guys speeded by 5 miles an hour, we got a ticket. The astronauts never got a ticket.
Of course not.
And Rathman, the Chevrolet dealer who provided the Corvettes, he was happy because when he turned those Corvettes in, the resale by the dealer was at big prices because they'd been astronaut Corvettes. Right. So everybody was happy.
I wonder if he had the astronauts sign the cars. And I wonder where those cars are now.
I don't know, surely there's probably a record in the Corvette Club.
There must be.
But that worked out very well for the dealer, and it certainly worked out well for the astronauts. And I have no idea how NASA dealt with it, because it certainly was a perk that would be questionable.
Absolutely. Well, the astronauts were like rock stars at the time.
They definitely were. And one of the things that we civilians had to deal with was the fact that they were the program. They were Life magazine, they were all of the hotels on the beach, they were the parties, everything was NASA. And what we had to keep telling ourselves was an astronaut never designed a spacecraft, they never checked out spacecraft, they never launched one. They just rode in them.
Right.
And
they didn't even fly them.
They were excellent pilots. I don't question the ability of the test pilots that became astronauts. They were incredible. But they were not the space program. They flew it.
But it's hard to sell the public on all that unsexy stuff.
That's true. Yeah. And the public was needed for that. And in fact, after the lunar program, we never again had that level of support, and one of the reasons is we did not have the rock stars.
January 1967, they're testing the Apollo spacecraft on the pad with 3 astronauts on board, Ed White, Roger Chaffee, and Gus Grissom. And there's a mishap.
This is Mike Wallace at the CBS Newsroom in New York. America's first 3 Apollo astronauts were trapped and killed by a flash fire that swept their moonship early tonight during a launch pad test at Cape Kennedy in Florida. Virgil Gus Grissom, 40 years old, one of the original Mercury astronauts, the first American astronaut to go twice into space. Edward White, 36 years old, the first American to walk in space. And rookie astronaut Roger Chaffee, 31 years old, training for his first space flight, Apollo 1, scheduled for February 21st. These 3 astronauts were aboard their spaceship 10 minutes from a simulated liftoff at Cape Kennedy when the fire hit at about 6:30 tonight. They were inside their spaceship, pressurized, buttoned up inside their spacesuits when the fire hit. A closed-circuit television camera was relaying pictures of the astronauts lying on their backs inside the spacecraft atop the 2-stage Saturn 1. There was a flash, and that was it, according to a NASA spokesman watching the television screen in the blockhouse a few hundred yards away from Launch Pad 34. The screen went blank, and he said there was no communication from the astronauts. They died silently and apparently swiftly.
The first Apollo spacecraft had a very difficult berthing. They were built in Downey, California. I was sent out as part of the NASA acceptance team to observe the final testing of the spacecraft, and they were still constructing while we were doing acceptance testing. It was a real push, and it was the first. They hadn't done it before. I don't think it's ever been known publicly, but one of the reasons for that difficulty was that, and here I have to be careful, the Union has its good parts, and it also has its potential bad parts by Union members who are discontented. It just goes with the game, and has not just in the space program, but throughout our history. We were having problems with failures in the spacecraft wiring, and a team was put on to try to see what was going on, and there was suspected sabotage.
At the factory?
At the factory. And in the final checkout of the Apollo spacecraft, we had FBI members trained as technicians in those crews to look for the problems.
Undercover?
Undercover. Never publicly announced. NASA would probably have denied it if they had been announced. But anyway, so there was difficulty in the factory. And also schedule was critical, and we were under heavy pressure from Washington to get that first launch off. So at the Cape, we did some of the final wiring at the Cape to get it out of the environment it was in. We had trouble from day one with the communications in the spacecraft. And we hadn't talked about my job at that time, but I was named as the chairman of the test control board for Apollo. And so the checkout requirements, the assembly requirements, the criteria for acceptance on all of that testing, that all came under the test control board. And I had support from the contractor teams, also support from the NASA guys. And so I was the final sign off on each one of the procedures, the checkout procedures leading up to launch and for the launch procedure. So it was difficult, and we had major problems. And there was some rework done as part of that. Never did really get the communications working the way they should have. And that particular day, we were doing a major closed capsule test. And one of the concepts that we had used through part of the Mercury, all of Gemini, and into Apollo was test it like you fly. In one of the early tests of a satellite, you do all your checkout on ground power, and you do a certain limited amount on the batteries that you're going to fly with, and that's a transition of configuration. We launched a spacecraft, unmanned, in which we had some problems in the countdown, went back to ground power, plugged all that back in, and that's all done with documentation. An engineer writes off a sheet of what he wants to do, how he wants to do it. It gets approved by the team management. You do it, and then you check off all of that again with quality control. Every step, a quality control stamp. Somewhere in the process, lost the control, and we were testing with ground power in a flight mode. Launched the vehicle with only ground power, batteries weren't hooked up, and it goes up and dies. So the rule was test like you fly. Well, the capsule was 100% oxygen in flight. And so when we do a closed door test, we do it 100% oxygen. There wasn't even any argument about that. You test like you fly. So in that particular test, there was 100% oxygen in the cabin. And throughout the afternoon, we're having difficulties. I went home that day probably 6 o'clock, and it wasn't very long till I got a phone call. There'd been a fire in a capsule. It was horrible. It was horrible for everybody involved. But the good part was that NASA management in Washington at that point in Apollo was on top of their game. By the time morning arrived, NASA had named an investigation team, had put all the protocols in place for securing the capsule. It was faultless. I just at this time even can't believe that our bureaucracy was able to work so well. So investigation team was named, and of course everything in the disassembly was all documented, looking for the problem. And I was pretty concerned personally because I'd signed off on that procedure with the hazard. And one of the things that we had dealt with, the crews were allowed to operate pretty much as they felt they needed to during the checkout period. So a lot of them had crib notes, documents that normally would not be in there for a mission. So there was way too much paper in the cockpit. And that was part of what caused it to happen so quickly. And the design of the Apollo followed aircraft design. The door opened to the inside, and the same way it does on an airliner. If you look at them today, they swing back in so that the cabin pressure helps maintain that seal. And you don't have to design nearly as tough a structure as if you were maintaining that pressure from the outside. So that's how it ended up that way. Weight was critical. So under the circumstances, the fire was almost instantaneous. The pressure increase was instantaneous, and you couldn't open the hatch. So that's how we ended up where we were. The investigation proceeded very carefully. I was concerned, having been the one that signed off on the procedure that was clearly hazardous. And it turned out that when the investigation team got formed, they needed expert witnesses, and I was the one that knew most about the procedure, so I ended up on the investigation instead of being investigated. So it all worked out well for me personally, and eventually pretty well determined what the cause was, but never finite answer. There were so many problems that had taken place before that when you're chasing all of those, you can't be sure that some of them didn't end up being a problem. So a redesign team was named to go out to Downey and do the redesign necessary as a result of what the investigating committee found. The final step before that was Congress established a oversight group, and they came down to the Cape, did a congressional review of what the investigating team had done, and fortunately we got through that cleanly. They accepted the recommendations that the investigators had done. And so we head out now, there were 7 of us, I guess, went out to Downey for the redesign. Redesign the hatch for external closure, get rid of the 100% oxygen, and put an oxygen-nitrogen mixture very close to what the atmosphere is. Did a bunch of redesign of the wiring in the cabin. So
intrinsic safety.
Intrinsic safety. And we had a couple of astronauts that were assigned to that team also in Downey. They weren't members of the team, but they were oversight. So we had some guys that were going to fly who watched pretty carefully what we were doing. It all got redesigned, and we moved on with the program and had only success from that point.
Now, you knew White and Chafee and Grissom. You'd worked with them. They also knew the risks.
They were part of the critique of the procedures that we were developing. For the vehicle, there are many systems: hydraulics, electrical, structural, and each of these had a group in the contractor who were responsible for that system. Some of them had been in the design, but all of them were intimately familiar with their systems. So when we built the procedures, we had NASA people assigned to each of those systems, and the combination of the NASA person plus the contractor wrote that portion of the procedures so that it was, through a couple, 3 iterations, something they could all agree was right, and that's when it got signed off and turned over for use. Every step in that process had a number tied with it. Every step in that process got signed off by quality control when the test was done. So nothing was random.
Don, from the Apollo program, you moved on to the Space Shuttle program, right?
I did, with a little stopover in Skylab.
Oh, that's right, Skylab. I remember Skylab falling back to Earth in, 1980?
Skylab was a quickie program. We were approaching the end of the Apollo program. We still had several spacecraft left, and there was a general feeling starting to develop that we aren't going to learn a bunch more once we'd had the rover on the moon. We aren't going to learn a bunch more, and we're kind of playing Russian roulette, and the whole thing goes to pieces if we lose a crew. So they were looking for something that maybe had a little less risk and would hopefully advance NASA's scientific community's relationship. So the Skylab was built as an interim. We took a second stage of the Saturn V and outfitted it for habitation. And also at the top, we ended up putting a solar telescope. And so we had some scientific reasons for doing it, and it was also able to be longer in space and to test man's ability to take longer duration. So it was put together relatively quickly, and as a result, it didn't end up with as good success it could have been. The initial launch, the solar panels got wrapped up, and so the crew was able to do some things with it to get the solar panel unfolded, and it ended up being a very good program and ended up accomplishing what was intended. And by that time, the government was ready to propose a new space program.
And really, Skylab there were a lot of lessons that were applied to the International Space Station later.
Correct. The habitation aspects of it, living in space for an extended period, is totally different than going up for a couple, 3-day mission.
The atrophy of your muscles alone is...
One of the things that a person doesn't normally think about is how do you accommodate the restroom needs in space?
For sure.
When things don't go where you want them to based on gravity.
Right.
And that was one of the things that was probably more man-hours was put into that than anything else on Skylab. And it ended up being pretty lousy.
Mm. What, did they just kind of use a suction system? Or?
Yes,
yeah.
Totally use a suction system. And by the time we got to the Space Shuttle, we had that background behind us and learned a few lessons. And not only using vacuum for the basic processes, but making sure that you had vacuum systems available in a number of places when something got out of control.
It occurs to me that we went from Apollo 1 to Skylab, but I really want to hear about how you felt the satisfaction maybe that you felt, the relief, whatever it was that you felt when Neil Armstrong finally took that step. So let's talk about that, because from the low of the Apollo 1 disaster to the high of Neil Armstrong actually finally setting foot on the lunar surface, how did you feel when that finally happened?
Felt pretty good. We had had Apollo 13 with the problems in the service module of a tank blowing up and having to truncate the mission, and having them survive by spending time in the lunar module using their life support system. And so the fact that we actually got the astronauts back in one piece from a disaster, that was a highlight for that part of the program. Yes, we can handle adversity. So got past that one, and when the lunar landing happened, it was such a world event that we were just elated that we had finally actually accomplished what people initially thought was a crazy mission.
30 seconds. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent. Mode control both auto. Descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. Port 13 is in. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
There was elation, but typical of our time with NASA. I was working 60, 70 hours a week, forgetting what day it was some of the time. And when we had the lunar landing, we were already behind on the next mission. So we had to go into overdrive. At the time, we'd like to lay back, celebrate. No, we're behind on the next mission. So back to work.
By the way, I don't even know if this merits asking because it's so preposterous, but what do you say to people who, for whatever reason, believe that the moon landings were staged in Burbank, at one of the studios?
Yeah, I've heard that all my career, and all you can say is we've got things back from the moon. The moon dirt that we brought back and the moon rocks weren't built in Burbank. Right. The other thing that I've dealt with from time to time during the Apollo program, NASA was working public relations, trying to maintain support. So they would set up speaking engagements for some of us out at universities and different things. And one of the things that came up almost universally was, how come we're spending $13 to $18 billion on the moon? And my answer is, we never spent $1 on the moon. Every one of those dollars that got spent going to the moon went to people to feed their kids, send them to college, pay for their health care, and eventually to help bury them. Right. No money was spent on the moon.
Right. And the technological development and the program development at universities worldwide, and the contribution to knowledge in general, pretty amazing. And manufacturing processes, and I mean, it just goes everywhere.
Yes. The ability to get body measurements by telemetry from the moon over the radio, that went into all kinds of things on Earth, where from an ambulance, the hospital knows before they get there what the person's condition is. So it's going into a lot of things. One of the areas is cameras. They didn't go with Canon. They went with Hasselblad, the best cameras in the world. Took the Hasselblad cameras and then modified them for space use. By the time they were done, they were $40,000 per camera, and we left some, I don't remember now, 8 or 10 cameras on the moon with each launch.
Oh, wow.
Weight was so critical for the lunar module and getting back that we didn't bring cameras back. We redesigned them to have film cartridges, and we brought the film back, left the cameras on the moon. So if anybody wants to have a nice camera, all you got to do is go to the moon and pick them up.
I love it. Not a barn find, but a moon find.
Yep.
So the shuttle program is the first attempt at a reusable spacecraft. And that was where you went after Skylab.
That's correct. It was a concept that no one quite knew how to do or what it ought to do even. So a team was set up from each NASA center sent representatives to Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, and formed a team which was a shuttle concept team, phase 1. And so we all gathered up there, and the purpose was to try to figure out what should a shuttle look like, what kind of mission should it have, how many people should it accommodate, and all of the concepts were driven. The payload group wanted one set of requirements. The manned spacecraft people wanted another set of requirements. The scientific community wanted to have something else. So we had a mishmash of requirements that we had to try to get down to what we would really make as the target requirements for the space shuttle. So the group met for, as I recall, it was about 9 months up there. And when I was assigned as the Kennedy Space Center member of that team to conceptualize what the shuttle should be. And so went up to Huntsville, and the team let contracts with Chrysler, of all people, and McDonnell Douglas, and Rockwell. We let contracts, and the contractor was to make recommendations, and we would have monthly reviews with each of the contractors and provide guidance for that month. That they would come back and answer what they had. We would take what we liked, change some of the rest of it. They'd go off for another month. So this developed some interesting concepts. The companies that had been involved in rocketry and missiles up to that point were taking the technology that existed and pushing it a little further. Something like the thermal tiles, nobody had any idea what to do with that. But Chrysler was the one outsider that had not been in the business before, but they knew about the Titan, which used hypergolic fuels, where you put one fuel into the other, together with the other in the engine, and it produces thrust. So they had some imaginative people in Chrysler, and one of the problems with the Apollo was the high pressures you had to have in the engines in order to get the thrust you needed. So pressurization of the tanks to get that liquid down to the engine was a big technical issue. So for the space shuttle, somebody in Chrysler came up with a wonderful idea that said, you know, hypergolics are great. They create the pressure when they mix. So how about we build 2 big tanks, and we pump a little bit of one hypergolic into the other tank, and it'll create pressure. And then we take a little of that one into the other tank, it'll create pressure. And so we'll just be self-pressurizing in the tanks, and that way we don't have to have these high-speed pumps, which created all the difficulty with big engines. So they proposed what they called the big dumb booster, which didn't have to have high-pressure pumps because they were going to feed the engines directly from the tanks, and the tanks were going to be made out of boilerplate. And so they came in with that. I think they lasted 1 review, maybe 2, and that was the end of that. Nobody wanted to try that one.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit risky, to say the least.
Yep. Yeah. After the work at Huntsville to conceptualize the shuttle, I went back to the Cape to a NASA job there, and I was named as the chief of the engineering office for the shuttle program. So my job was to take the Apollo configuration facilities we had, decide what we needed for the space shuttle, and to design and construct that, get it ready for the shuttle. And a secondary role that I had was as a member of the team that was on the design team of NASA for the space shuttle. So we had a cadre of probably, I think at that time, 400 engineers at the Cape who had gone through Mercury and Gemini and Apollo. So we had a pretty good background for getting ready for the shuttle. So when I came back and headed up the engineering for the project, it was a piece of cake getting that part done. The big problem we always had was with the shuttle design.
And it's probably worth mentioning, up to this point, spacecraft are literally a capsule with no control system for use in the atmosphere and a parachute splashdown. But now you're talking about a reusable spacecraft that has to be able to fly in the atmosphere on return. So it has to have all of the same systems that an airplane does, including landing gear. So you're adding tons of systems and a whole lot of weight.
Yes, that's true. And one of the things that was conceptually checked out, at least, was a flyback booster. The initial concept was the whole thing has to be able to be reused. So the first month or two up in Huntsville, we had contractors proposing a monster airplane that would carry the smaller space shuttle on the back of it, fly up to 40,000 feet, release the spacecraft, and have the shuttle then go on to orbit, bring that big booster back, use it over again. The process of doing that, I think it took us 1 to 2 weeks to price it out and decide that we weren't going to have a reusable booster. The size just got to be the size of an aircraft carrier, and it just was not practical. So that's when we ended up picking up the solid rocket motors that subsequently gave us great difficulty. The space shuttle was going to be expensive, and we knew it.
Right.
By presidential directive, all U.S. spacecraft would be launched on the space shuttle.
Most people think of the space shuttle and they think of NASA because they're almost one and the same. But the Air Force figures into the shuttle program too.
That was a result of a presidential edict that all U.S. payloads would fly on the space shuttle, and that in turn was done to capture the budget that the Air Force was using for expendables and make that available for the development of the space shuttle.
And the interesting thing here is that there's a black program behind all of it, and an agency that didn't officially exist called the National Reconnaissance Office. Tell us about that.
That was a very interesting situation. Not knowing what went into the presidential decision, one would think that he had to know about the National Reconnaissance Office and their needs. But their classification system, everything was above top secret for the spy satellites that we were flying. In the early 60s, the Air Force decided that they wanted to build on what NASA was doing and then have Air Force surveillance satellites. And they took it basically was a Titan booster with an Apollo spacecraft, and underneath it a laboratory that had telescopes, and they were going to fly Air Force surveillance missions with a modified Gemini. That became the Manned Orbital Laboratory program, which was advertised as an Air Force research program, of course, and that was to fly from Vandenberg Air Force Base. Vandenberg was the launch site because it's on the west coast, has ocean south of it you can fly over, and they wanted, for spy reasons, you want to cover the whole Earth's surface with your satellite, and that can only be done with a polar orbit, and Kennedy Space Center was equatorial orbits and didn't cover some parts that the Air Force wanted to see. So they established Vandenberg as their launch site for Manned Orbital Laboratory. They picked a launch complex on the south base, started to build it. At that time, in parallel, the National Reconnaissance Office was designing satellites for monitoring the Earth.
And wasn't the Keyhole satellite part of the NRO program?
The Keyhole program was a program of the National Reconnaissance Office. The first was Keyhole 1, And that was a satellite that had the cameras, but they couldn't bring them back. So what they did was design capsules, and they put the film in a capsule and brought the capsule back, and they were able to build enough of a heat shield for that capsule, and it came back, pulled parachutes, and then Air Force airplanes snagged the parachutes, and when they landed, the film went immediately to Washington. So it was laborious, but it worked. And then during the Keyhole series, went from Keyhole 1 with increasing capability up to Keyhole 11. Keyhole 11 was the last one which had capability to do pretty much anything that the NRO wanted. So they went an intermediate stage, which I think was like Keyhole 3 or somewhere in that range. They built a camera that had that could take the pictures, digitize them, and then send them back by radio and get rid of the snagging them with the aircraft. So that was a major increase. And
well, and also the speed of the intelligence being processed and interpreted, right? So
yes, everything Keyhole was above top secret. It was special compartmentalized access.
Is it true, do you know, if those satellites, even in the late 60s, could read a newspaper over your shoulder?
They could do a lot. Capability is pretty good.
Yeah.
Of course, when we put up a spy satellite, the Russians track it, and so they immediately know where it's going. And it crosses Russia every 24 hours, covers all of Russia. However, they're not dumb, so they cover things up. And so the initial photographs that we got, once they had time to a few days to get where they wanted them, everything was covered up by the time we crossed over. So that got to be difficult. So the NRO had to come up with a little better systems, and we ended up, I think you know, we have now the capability of looking underground for water lines and whatever.
Right, there's ground penetrating radar.
Yes.
Yeah.
That concept came from the NRO because it reached a point where we had to be able to penetrate their camouflage.
Right.
And it did. And the capability's gotten pretty good by now.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive. What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? I know this is a formidable technical task, one that may not be accomplished before the end of this century. Yet current technology has attained a level of sophistication where it's reasonable for us to begin this effort.
Tell us a little bit about the Vandenberg shuttle.
As a result of the presidential edict, they had to fly the shuttle for the Air Force, and Vandenberg is where they do all of their spy missions.
Some of the more sensitive military space equipment is already arriving here. Contracts have just been awarded for the initial Star Wars defense research here. Shuttle launches are seen as a crucial element in the attempt to build President Reagan's idea of an anti-missile shield in space. But long before the military shuttle gets into space, there have been problems to cure on the ground. The landscaping of 10 miles of Californian interstate highway has been resculptured to enable the shuttle to travel from its landing ground to its launch pad. The key reason for putting the launch facility here on the California coast is that for the first time the military will be able to put their shuttles into a polar orbit. From such an orbit, it's possible to see much more of the Earth's land masses than from the east-west orbit that's used at Kennedy.
Part of the process in the government always is, let's do it in the cheapest way. We need to reuse. So the decision was made that we would reuse what they call Space Launch Complex 6. Slick 6 for the Space Shuttle, although it had been designed for a Titan, and as time showed, that was a bad mistake. The design was totally incompatible. A great deal of money was spent on the launch pad itself. All of the facilities which you would see at Kennedy Space Center had to be somehow replicated as Corps of Engineers facilities. And the Air Force contracted with the same major contractors that we had at Kennedy Space Center. And those contractors, of course, were still totally involved at Kennedy. So they had a different cadre of people at Vandenberg. And as good corporate management, they made sure that nothing at the Kennedy would work at Vandenberg. So they were starting with a clean slate. They had an airfield on the North Base. They needed a facility to do the maintenance for the shuttle, so that was a major facility. They had to get external tanks in from Louisiana, where they were built, so that meant they needed a port. So it's really getting to be a pretty big project, and so with the Corps not being really accustomed to what's going on in a space environment, and with the contractors motivated to have as big a project as they could, it got into budget and schedule problems pretty quick. So I put together a group of my engineering guys, finance guys, and we flew out here to do an assessment. The general in charge of the shuttle program at Vandenberg was General Katina, and he was at their headquarters in Los Angeles. And he had come out to the Cape, and we had talked before I flew out with the crew, and he said, I just got my first star, and they told me that if Vandenberg is successful, I get the second star, and if not, they'll find another job for me. So he said, if you have any problems, you call me.
He wanted that second star.
He wanted the second star. And we knew before we ever came that it was a difficult situation because the Corps was not accustomed to doing the kind of work they required, and the contractors were milking it without question. So we get all the information and took a day to put it all together, and it was such a horror story that I knew that it was going to hit the fan when we got out. So I called General Coutinho the night before we flew out, my valet, and said, my instructions are to bring this information directly back to my center director and not talk to Air Force management. But I said, this is something you need to see first. So I said, I can't show up at your air base. So we had a meeting at the Velvet Turtle on Sepulveda Boulevard the next morning. We had breakfast together, and I debriefed what was going on. And he said, give me a day or so if you can before you get that into the system. So I kind of dragged my feet for one day and then went to my center director. And the next day he said, we got to set up an appointment for you to brief the administrator of NASA tomorrow. And NASA 4, that's the plane. The East Center has an airplane. And he said, NASA 4 is ready to take you up there tomorrow for a meeting. So I flew up, and the administrator at the time was a man by the name of Jim Beggs, Beggs. He had been originally a Convair guy, but he was NASA administrator. And before I left, my center director said, when you go to brief Mr. Beggs, just be businesslike. He's a little unusual guy, but you just do your job. Okay. So I get into the headquarters and asked and it's a big room, and I get led by the associate administrator to a couch on a wall, and I look across, and here's a big desk, and the administrator's there, and he's got the paper up in front of it, and he's reading the Washington paper, and he's got the sports section, and I'm thinking he'll put it down and we'll go on with it. The associate administrator sitting beside me looked over, he said, start your briefing. So with him in the newspaper, I started my briefing, and I went through about a 20-minute briefing. And when I got done, Mr. Beggs put the newspaper down and started asking me questions from the first of my briefing. So he was listening intently the whole time. He was hearing what I said the whole time. So, but it was awfully unnerving for me. So anyway, I went back home, and 2 days later, I got called up to my center director's office, and he said, there's an agreement been made between NASA and the Air Force for us to provide a technical director to the shuttle program at Vandenberg, and you're selected. So it was a little rocky getting going, but I was the technical director, and it turned out that the contractors had chosen different concepts for almost everything from Kennedy. At Kennedy, the stacking is done in the vehicle assembly building, and the cranes in there are the finest cranes ever been built, and our guys had continuity from Mercury to Gemini to Apollo, knew how to spec things that would be just right. The Corps of Engineers went to crane contractors, said we need a crane that'll lift so much, and they got junkyard cranes.
So they weren't the precision that was required?
Nowhere near. The crew access arm of Kennedy is a swing arm, and it's operated hydraulically, and it has redundant hydraulic systems. And then as a last resort, if anything were to happen, because it's the emergency egress system, we had a pulley system with an explosive charge and massive weight that would just take it back regardless of what the hydraulics was trying to do. We had everything just, and then they had a basket that would take on a run, take them down to a state bunker. And the contractors at Vandenberg decided they'd like a slide assembly, like a big drawer coming out, and it's 35 feet long, a big drawer, and it's got to operate within a certain number of seconds. So when I got out here, they had installed the arm, and they were just starting to test it, and the solid rocket motors were assembled and checked out and prepared in another building on Slick 6 area, and they had just installed the crane, and they were moving the test weight to test the crane. And so I went out to the access arm because they were going to run a test. And they had tried some things to fix some things, and it wasn't going well. But I went up there, and while I was up there, I saw a GSA car come roaring up the road, pull up at the bottom. I said, "Mr. Nichols, Mr. Nichols." I went down. Turned out they had been lifting a test weight, and all the bearings out of the crane came tumbling down and bouncing all over us. So it was just typical of what was going on. Had a lot of difficulties. We had generation of the liquid nitrogen. It takes a lot of liquid nitrogen to purge everything, keep everything safe with the hydrogen. So they installed a plant out there to generate the GN2, and the Corps of Engineers did piping for the hydraulics, for the GN2, for air, for water. They put in miles of pipeline. And so we go to run the first test, and they can't get GO2 from the tanks because it's leaking everywhere. And it turned out that the Corps was using the wrong kind of pipe, the wrong kind of weld, so it all had to be dug up, cut out all the joints, everything redone, and we ended up replacing every single crane that the Corps had contracted for. So it was pretty much a disaster. And structurally, they had poured tons and tons of concrete for a Titan configuration where the decision had been made, we're going to use that same space, but all that concrete is wrong for a space shuttle. And then on top of that, the weather problems were such, the contractors had elected, instead of using cranes to erect, because they didn't have a structure, they elected to do what they had done with the Titan, use a trailer concept where you come out, tip it up, and the payload attachment in the payload bay is so critical that it's thousandths of an inch, and the weather at Vandenberg is notably windy, and so a big assembly building was added to the program. So we went through many, many problems, finally ended up getting them all solved, and got a facility verification vehicle out here, brought it out, ran it through the process on North Base, and then it's hauled from North Base all the way down to the South Base on a massive trailer.
And that was the Enterprise, right?
Yeah. And the trailer's called a K-Mag. They were built in Italy, and they had 88 wheels, and they were all steerable because it has to turn in its own length, and it's got this orbiter on it that's 120 feet long, and so it's a pretty big thing. K-Mag, in order to cut their cost, had cut a deal with Michelin where the wheels would be supplied by Michelin, and they would have tires, and Michelin had white letter raised Michelin on 88 wheels on this shuttle transporter. Well, just as a little sidelight, when that K-Mag was delivered, they brought it in by barge into the harbor we had built for the external tank, brought it up, and the shuttle was a tenant on a base that was commanded by a SAC commander, a General Watkins. And he was very proud of his position, and here we were on his base. So the morning that the transporter was delivered with all those wheels, he came down to see it. Well, General Watkins walked down there, took one look at that, and he said, "Paint them over." So he ended up, we destroyed the advertising that Michelin was counting on, and there was a big lawsuit between Michelin and K-Mag in Italy over cost of all of that. So everything just wasn't going real well. But we got everything done. We were just about ready to get the first vehicle out there for checkout. And about that time, Challenger went down.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
It happened just over 1 minute into flight.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles. We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
The morning after the Challenger failure, the Air Force immediately got to the Pentagon and said, "We can't trust the shuttle. We need to have our Titans available as an interim until the shuttle gets online and is proven to be okay." With the investment they had, at that point, it was assumed they would come back later. So the facility was maintained for quite some time. But the NRO moved on to the Titan again, and we were flying all those vehicles. And I decided it was getting time to retire. About that time, we had about 3 or 4 failures between the Cape and the West Coast. And so there came the requirement for a presidential launch investigation. So a crew was put together, and I became one of the guys that was on that national review. And we spent 6 months and reviewed everything in the national arena in space launch, made a number of changes in what was done, how it was contracted, how it was built. And at the end of that, I said, I've had enough. Goodbye. I was asked a number of times after that. I'd get a phone call from one of the guys in Washington say, we're setting up a team for this. How about you? How about helping us? No. When I close the door, I close the door. So when they're on them, it's cars, motorcycles, and related things.
Don Nichols, thank you.
Been a pleasure, and looking forward to this.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. Follow, rate, and review the show, and go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage, and you can throw a few bucks in the gas tank. We're winding down the clock on 2023, and I'm working on a couple of special projects I'm excited to bring to you. So stick with me, and I will see you back here on Wednesday, December 20th, for more of the people and stories behind the machines. So until then, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.